Welcome to the first episode of the Straight to the Point podcast, Antivaccination Associations. I'm your host, Isaac Lindenberger, and today you will hear a conversation between myself and two others who know the anti-vaccine movement very well. Our first guest is Dr. Peter Sears, brother of the popular anti-vaccine doctor Bob Sears, who is well known for making Dr. Bob's Alternative Schedule. Dr. Peter Sears, on the other hand, is pro-vaccine, and while he does not discuss his brother, we do discuss common misconceptions related to vaccines with a formerly anti-vaccine mother, Kristina Denuit. So please welcome them both and enjoy the show. Okay, we are live. So, welcome everyone. This is the first episode of the Straight to the Point podcast, and we are going to be discussing vaccines in a broad range of topics related to immunizations. Today we have two special guests. We have Dr. Peter Sears and Kristina Denuit. How do you say that?
Close enough. Yeah.
Close. Awesome. So, thank you both for coming on.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks.
Good to chat.
Yeah, I'm excited for this. So, okay, let's start by getting into the introductions because everyone pretty much knows who I am. So let's explain who you guys are. Personally, just a real quick aside, I have an anti-vax mom and I have a pro-vaccine brother. And with that strange family dynamic, I try to get along with both of them because, one's my brother, one's my mom. I care about both of them. So I try to see things from both sides. And so that's what I think both of you also do. So that's why I wanted to invite both of you on, because we share that sentiment of trying to see things from a unbiased perspective. So in terms of your experiences with vaccines, let's start with you, Kristina. What are your experiences with vaccines? What's been your ideological kind of journey with understanding vaccination?
Well, growing up, as far as I remember, I got most, if not all of my, the expected vaccines, in the very least, what you needed to get into school. Had my first son, didn't really think anything of it. However, I'm terrified of needles as it is, so I didn't really want the epidural. So that led me to a Facebook group that helps with going unmedicated. And long story short, in that regard, it introduced me to the fact that there weren't people that vaccinate, or there were people that didn't vaccinate. I didn't really understand it, but I didn't think anything too much of it either way. And they had a bunch of things that seemed kind of scary, kind of questionable, and I still had continued to vaccinate for quite some time, up until my oldest was about a year and a half. He actually missed his year appointments because I had some medical issues that were going on, so that prevented me from making that year appointment. I got his 12 and 18 month vaccinations done at 17 months. And starting 3 or 4 weeks after that, he had a almost 3-month bout of just constant throwing up and diarrhea, and nobody really seemed to know what was going on exactly. Nobody questioned vaccines, and at the time, at first I didn't either, to be honest. But as time went on, just the fact that there was no other explanation, and it seems like everything goes back to vaccines. So you spend enough time in those groups, and especially the things that have no other explanation. It starts to make you wonder if maybe it could be. And so I spent probably 3 or 4 years after that convinced that it had to be, that there's no other option. And after a couple of years, I actually ended up getting into a fight with one of my best friends from junior high, and it hurt. I was about at a point where we quit talking. I wasn't willing to stay friends with somebody that I thought was heartless because, it was terrifying. Those 3 months, there was times where I literally thought, I was going to leave my son for a few minutes and I was going to come back to him dead because he was vomiting in his sleep and it wasn't waking him up. So I was afraid that he was going to asphyxiate on his own vomit. And it just seemed that she didn't care about this, when in reality she was just more aware of why it wasn't very likely to be vaccines, and that was kind of the catalyst to me joining Vaccine Talk. It's a Facebook group. For those of you that might not be familiar, it allows those that are on both sides of the spectrum and anywhere in between to discuss vaccines. And I had tried joining prior, didn't have a real great experience. I'm not sure now if that was really, if that was because I just wasn't actually ready to change my mind. I was kind of where I am now, in the sense of, if I changed my mind, I changed my mind. If I didn't, I didn't. I was open to the information either way. But being anti-vax at the time, the first time I joined, it felt primarily like I was being attacked. And in retrospect, I'm not really sure if that's the way it really was. But I went in, wanting to better understand the pro-vax perspective when I joined again, and especially with all this fear of mandatory vaccinations coming. Whether or not that actually happens might be a different story. But if mandatory vaccines did become a thing, I didn't want to still have this gut-wrenching fear of vaccines that I did at the end of this last year. So I stayed in Vaccine Talk. I think I just kind of watched the post for the first month or so, and then I got pretty active. I think in like January or February, asked a lot of questions, and slowly started to see that a lot of the stuff that I thought about vaccines, it was true to a point, but a lot of it was caused by misperceptions and half truths, and some of them were just blatant lies. Well, not necessarily lies, but it's like the game of telephone. You get this partial truth here, or you get this truth, somebody else hears it, they forward it on, and then so on and so forth. And then, same as the game of telephone, you have this initial point, and it's been turned into this completely different situation that has nothing to do with where it started. And after seeing almost every point of the vaccine debate, kind of refuted, it led me to have a more open mind, and to take it more serious, to start looking into the anti-vax perspectives that were coming along, if that makes sense.
Yeah, wow, that's quite the journey. So when did you join Vaccine Talk the second time and start to look more into the other side?
I think that was in either November or December of last year.
Wow, so that's really recent.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, that's very interesting. Vaccine Talk has actually helped me a lot too with learning information about vaccines. That's actually where I met Dr. Sears, was in that group. So speaking of Dr. Sears, I wanted to ask you the same question.
Sure. Okay, real quick, on the side, someone's saying it's set to friend. That's why I was trying to wave, that they were saying it was still set to friends only and not public.
Oh, okay.
That's why I really tried to wave, because that popped up. I'm not sure if it's still set to friends only or not.
All right, I will try to fix that while you,
Okay.
what was the question?
Sure.
Oh yeah, what's your experience with vaccines?
So I'm a family physician, board certified family practice starting off. I'm sure a lot of people listening in know the Sears name, and So I finished med school in 2002, and I went into what's known as a medical residency, which is, your chosen specialty, whether it's surgery, pediatrics. So I did a 3-year family practice residency at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. Go Vols. Um, so that was during the time. I mean, 2002 to 2005 was a pretty crazy time for what was going on in the world of vaccines. The whole Wakefield paper had come out, and there's this whole big fervor over that, and so so of course, a lot of people, a lot of things you'll hear in anti-vax. A very common thing you hear is that medical students and young doctors don't get any. They quote, they get a half-hour class on vaccines in meds or something like that, which is just utterly wrong. I mean, in so many ways. I mean, in med school, you study immunology, you study virology, biochemistry, epidemiology, and you're also in doctor's offices as a medical student, and people don't really realize it. And a lot of what goes on when you do rotations in pediatricians' offices and family practice offices, even as a student in the first and second year, you're talking about vaccines. I mean, obviously, not just the schedule, but so as a resident, fast forward to 2002 to 2005, our program really took it upon themselves with all that's come out to say, hey, we need to make sure our residents are looking into this, and is there something to all this, some of this data. And so, we were really challenged to do that. And so really in the past 2 decades, medical education, educating young doctors, especially pediatricians and family practice docs who immunize almost everybody in this country, are more than educated on vaccines, and not just the schedule. And yeah, I mean, we know the data, we see all this. So it frustrates when I see that. But anyway, so getting back to that, so I graduated, or I finished my residency in 2005, and went back to California and worked with my father, William Sears, and my 2 brothers, they're all 3 pediatricians, Bob and Jim. Was there for a couple of years, and we vaccinated in our practice, we certainly had a percentage of individuals who did not, or did the alternate schedule. But then I was called back so I was there until 2008, and so I decided to move back to Tennessee for various reasons, and I love the Nashville area. So in 2008, I found a community health center, which community health centers, for those who don't know, are places that are set up in usually underserved areas, either in metro areas or rural areas where people don't have as much access to physicians. And these centers cater to lots of Medicare patients, but also uninsured patients. So I found a clinic there. There's a program that's a national program called Vaccines for Children, or it's also known as VFC. It's a government-run program that provides low cost or free vaccines to these types of community health centers. And so one of my big jobs, well, basically other than running the clinic, was actually running that program, Vaccines for Children, which I did for 7 years. So obviously we were a very busy clinic, administering, thousands of vaccines over that time. And so, I came just with through my experience with the data and knowing the research, plus on top of that, my real world experience, has had me, in the, very, very much a pro-vaccine advocate. And that's what and I was there until a couple years ago, and then decided to kind of change tacks to a little bit more of a private practice situation. But I think I'm eventually probably going to get back into the community health setting, because I really enjoy that calling. So that's a little bit about me, I guess.
Yeah, awesome. So you've experienced the effects of vaccines firsthand. In terms of your experience with administering and experiencing vaccines,
Yeah.
how often did you see adverse reactions, and also how often do you see preventable diseases that could have been prevented from vaccines?
Sure. Well, so as far as I guess it would depend. What do you term an adverse reaction? Far and away the most common things we would see would be pain, redness, swelling at the injection site. Obviously, some increased fussiness, for a day or two. A little bit of a fever. Child not sleeping well for a few nights, as Christine, you're probably well aware of these kind of things. And in the rarest instances of things I saw, at no point have I ever witnessed an anaphylactic, life-threatening, immediate reaction to a vaccine. That's something I've never seen. That's something most colleagues I talk to about have just never experienced, because these are literally 1 in a million reactions, and you'd really expect most physicians not to actually witness those just because they're so rare. But, we had several instances of fevers, obviously, several instances of febrile seizures, a few days up to maybe a couple weeks after the vaccine. But in many of those cases, the children had also developed, an ear infection or some other kind of illness that may attribute to the febrile seizure, which are quite common. They can happen up to 5% of kids, and they're self-limiting and not serious, but they're frightening, obviously. So far and away, though, as far as the most serious adverse event that could potentially be attributed to vaccine would have been febrile seizures, which there is a slight increase in the rate of febrile seizures following the MMR vaccine. That is documented, but it's still very rare. About 1 in 2,500 kids, only 1 in 2,500 kids that receive the MMR vaccine will then suffer a subsequent febrile seizure. So it's, again, I didn't witness any of these horror stories you hear about of sudden regressions. My child was fine, and then, is shortly diagnosed on the spectrum. And again, no anaphylactic reactions, and nobody turning into the Incredible Hulk.
Yeah, we'll definitely be bringing that up. That is a adverse reaction in VAERS. So, did you see any preventable diseases in your clinic? I mean, you were mainly administering vaccines, right? But
Sure. So I've seen. I can count on, I think, as in 18 years of practice, I've seen 3 cases of chickenpox, all in unvaccinated kids, and I've never personally seen a patient with measles. Although our practice in California had some issues with very small numbers of that, but I never personally actually saw a patient with measles. Rotavirus, definitely, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I saw it before the vaccine we use now was introduced in 2006. So I guess technically I saw a lot of VPD, vaccine preventative illness, before we had a vaccine to actually prevent it. Now let's see. Thinking, the cases of pneumonia, just a few, but they never actually were able to test to see whether it was a strain that was actually in the pneumococcal vaccines. So, really, to answer your question, hardly ever in children that are vaccinated on the schedule, or even just in a slightly altered schedule.
Okay, thank you. All right, so now everyone knows a little bit about all of us, so we can start getting into some of the topics we want to discuss.
Sure.
So let's start with risks and benefits. So we'll start with Kristina this time and get your thoughts on this, and then we'll go over to Dr. Sears. We're bouncing around a little bit. So, in terms of risk versus benefits, even if you believe personal stories about vaccine injury, the point is there's a small group of people that you're talking to. You're probably seeking out other people who have vaccine injury. You're creating an in-group where you have all these friends who think similar things, and it can appear like it's a bigger group than it actually is. So that's something important to keep in mind. But at the very least, if you're concerned about the risk of vaccines, you should also consider the benefits and make a cost-benefit analysis. So, Kristina, in your experience, you probably saw a lot about the risks of vaccines, but did you see a lot about the benefits and any balance of that discussion?
Okay, you can still hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay. So, obviously when I was very staunchly anti-vaccine for, like I said, anywhere between 2 and 4 years after I had come to this conclusion that it was vaccines that caused this horrible long-term experience. And, I spent a lot of time in these groups that were supposedly um, intended to educate people about vaccines. And when you hear all these stories, like you said, it's easy to think that they're running rampant. And it wasn't until I joined Vaccine Talk, I had seen, you know, a little bit here and there about some of the benefits or like the seriousness of these diseases. But when you hear over and over and over and over again, this disease is just this, or this, or that disease is just this or this. Measles is a really good example. The illness itself may not be super serious in the vast majority of people and children. But then you have the situation that arises of, I can't remember what it stands for, but you have SSPE, which I had come to find out affects around 1 in 1,000 children or people that have developed measles. And so far, the rate is either at or very, very close to a 100% fatality rate, opposed to, even if I'm not saying it is or isn't, I don't, I can see where both people on either side of the spectrum feel about that, about whether or not vaccines cause death. But regardless, it's nowhere near 1 in 1,000 of
Right.
those that do end up of those that do get the vaccine, opposed to 100% fatality rates. And then going to the polio vaccine, you hear about how the polio vaccine didn't come around until polio was already in the decline. And it doesn't make a lot of sense when that's all you hear. And deaths are going downhill. But then those that are getting polio are still have a very, very high rate of paralytic polio. And the thing that the polio virus did is it significantly decreased the level of polio cases where the end result was paralysis. And you've got other vaccines that those are the two that really stick out, as well as the Hep B vaccine. You hear, people think of hepatitis B and think of a sexually transmitted disease. And, it's true to a point, but it's a blood-borne pathogen. So you don't have to be having sex or injecting, drugs to come across it.
Right.
And, realizing just how many different ways you can actually, it's not super likely, no, but realizing just how many different ways you can potentially contract it. And the fact that I think the statistic, I don't remember offhand, but I think the statistic is 1 in 3 children, give or take, have no idea where they developed hepatitis B from. And a significant portion of those that develop it as children, I don't remember if it's death or if it's just chronic infection thereafter, but it can, those that do develop it have the potential to have, very serious reactions from the hepatitis B.
Right. So the risks of the preventable diseases are almost never touched upon. They're very
Mhm.
minimized. It's like, oh, these things are harmless, but vaccines are very dangerous. So, Dr. Sears, in terms of risks and benefits, it seems like when you acknowledge risks, it increases trust to a degree. Because if you say there's no risks ever, people don't trust you. But
Right.
it seems like the risks are very exaggerated in those discussions and the benefits are very undermined. So, how do you try to have conversations where you balance those topics out?
Sure, and that's obviously a very valid concern, or at least it's a very normal concern for parents, obviously. And so, really, just before I touch on that, one thing I wanted to mention about, you asked about the vaccine preventable disease that I'd seen before. One that I can't believe I blanked was whooping cough. Is actually something
Oh,
that's still common, and seen a lot of whooping cough in my day, and that's, you know, even amongst vaccinated individuals. And there's a lot of reasons, but it's actually not a great vaccine. And that's why we're encouraging adults to get boosters to control these outbreaks. But that is one. And if you're going to say, far and away, the most vaccine preventable disease that we're still seeing is certainly whooping cough, because it's just, frankly,
ah,
it's not the best vaccine, really. And it used to, in the 80s, the vaccine that was causing all these reactions, they changed it and took it from the whole cell vaccine to the acellular. In so doing, it made it a lot safer, but also made it a lot less effective. So that's
hmm. Oh,
that's kind of a little side note. But so risk, and also briefly, Kristina, you mentioned the SSPE being 1 in 1,000, but some newer research is actually saying it might be closer to about 1 in every 600, actually, of the
ooh,
devastating. So they're actually finding more data as they're seeing measles around the world is making a big comeback. There were 140,000 cases last year of measles around the world. So they're getting more data on SSPE, and they think it's a lot more prevalent than they used to think. But anyway,
interesting.
so when I'm talking about risk benefits with my patients, I say, look, nothing's 100% safe. That doesn't exist in life. I mean, we could, I mean, that's impossible. I think we've reached a point in vaccinations that we've gotten pretty darn close, but there's just nothing in life as 100%. And but when, like you said, Kristina, when you point out all the potential complications of all these VPDs, I'm just going to refer to it as those. Far and away the risks, the benefits are far way outweigh the risks. In when I look at the data, I'm evidence-based practice. That means I practice based on the literature and outcomes that I've seen, my colleagues have seen over decades. And I give a good analogy, actually. I say, well, you're worried about risks of vaccine, but far and away, exponentially, the most dangerous thing you're going to do today is drive your child from your house to my office and back to your house. And so when you think about these, we make decisions every day in life that are far and away more risky than vaccinations, and we don't think about that, but it just because it's every part of everyday life.
Right. I've heard if there's no side effects, there's no primary effects.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I mean, the part of the reason we have these side effects is the vaccines doing what they're supposed to do. And in a very small percentage of people, they may experience some type of anaphylactic reaction or something like that, but it's just so incredibly rare, and the data just really shows that. So, but but then, of course, I know we want to discuss the topic of vaccine injury. I know is on the list too. So I'll let you go on with what you want to talk about next, Isaac.
Perfect. So, okay, thank you both for that. That was pretty good. Next, I want to talk about, before we get into some of the more gritty details, evidence and knowledge. So, when one seriously considers the benefits, they do realize they outweigh the risk if you're making an objective analysis, at least from what I can see. And that doesn't mean you can't think about the risk, but you should probably realize that you're not an expert, right? So you can understand something to a limited degree, but it doesn't mean that you are very proficient in it. And so I think that this, let's see if I can get it coming up here, is a good representation of that. So sorry for the 3D effects here, but here we go. This is the Dunning-Kruger effect. Can you guys see this on screen?
Dunning-Kruger effect. Yes, I can see it.
Yes. So what this says is, as your knowledge in the field increases, at first you don't know anything, but when you know a little bit, you think you know everything. Then as you start learning more, you realize the field's deeper. Then it's starting to make sense. Then as you know a lot, you realize it's complicated and you don't know as much as you maybe thought you did. So, in terms of that, what do you guys think about what have you guys experienced any similar? Have you experienced that at all in your practice, Peter?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, let's look. Immunology and vaccines are really, really, really complicated. I mean, I mean, one of the most difficult courses I took in med school was immunology. It's incredibly complex, and trying to dilute it down, to a bare bones thing is really, really almost impossible. And
Mm,
so, you have well-intentioned people that go online looking for vaccine research, and I mean, if you go down one of the wrong rabbit holes or get involved in some of these very, dubious Facebook groups or websites, you're going to run into a lot of people that claim to be experts, or claim they've been in the medical field for this and that, but they never really say what it is they do. Or, yeah, I mean, it's
right.
you meet a lot of experts online, and it's just I
Yes.
tell people it's incredible. I mean, there are people that do this for a living, and they and they'll be the first one to tell you it's incredibly complex.
Right. They know the most of anyone. They say they know little. It's a
Right.
sign of a true expert. Christina, in terms of your experience with understanding vaccines, did you feel more confident when you knew objectively less information?
Um, it still kind of goes back and forth, to be honest.
Hmm.
However, uh, you don't know that you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
And so, coming to a realization just how complex vaccines really are, like Dr. Sears was saying, you've got, uh, you know, multiple classes or courses that you have to take um, that are directly relevant to vaccination. So even though they don't have a course strictly for vaccines, and you hear doctors don't have a course for vaccines, what? They're injecting
Right.
my child with this, and they don't take a class on
You
this?
don't even know. Right.
And it's like, well, no, they don't, and this is why. And so realizing just how complex vaccines are, because even growing up, children are explained the basics of there's a virus in this, and it's put into you, and it creates this immune response to help prevent this illness or this disease. And that's about the basis of the understanding of, I think, I'm not going to say, everybody in the anti-vax movement by any means, by and far. There are some very intelligent people in there. And
Yes, there are.
I'm not going to say otherwise. It's part of the reason that, I am against mandates, because, you need to come to a certain understanding um, to have a view either way. And um, I feel like mandates would kind of close people off to be would close people's willingness to look into the situation on either end of the spectrum, and
Yes.
would just kind of close them, make them bear down on their views,
Yeah.
because
It's like reactants. Like they
mhm,
are told that they can't think something and you want to think it more, you want to explore it more. And like you said, you have a lot of, intelligent anti-vaxxers. I'm friends with many anti-vaxxers. I get along with them pretty well and they are smart. And that's what brings me into my next topic for discussion. So that's what you brought that up perfectly. Um, Trust, intelligence, and information. So I think this is important because in thinking about what you trust, you should think about why you trust it. So, possessing reliable and accurate information, it isn't about how smart you are. It is about who you trust. And that's why there's so many smart people in the anti-vax movement. And there are reasons to be distrustful of conventional reality. I have my own quarrels with the modern paradigm, but vaccinations have proven themselves. So, let's go to this little thing over here. You guys might both find this kind of interesting. Okay. Love that 3D effect. All right, here it is. So, why misinformation is about who you trust, not what you think. And this goes into this guy who didn't wash his hands for over a decade. So, that's a thing. So, I encourage people to look into that, and I have that resource. All these resources are going to be in the comments and in Vaccine Talk after. But I want to talk to you guys about that. So, Dr. Sears, how do you think about what we're talking about now? How you can be smart, but it depends on where you put your trust and in your sources, really.
Well, absolutely. And look, I mean, I think that one of the big reasons that a lot of people have come to sort of be mistrustful of vaccines or what their doctors are saying about vaccines stems partially, at least, in just a general mistrust of the medical establishment
Mm,
in
yeah.
general. Not just about vaccines, but just really about a whole lot of things. And I think that,
Umbrella.
for a lot of years we were practicing medicine in the wrong direction, just focusing on treating disease and not the whole patient. And one of my prime focuses in practice is preventive medicine and integrative medicine, which kind of has the whole patient in mind. But I think that people already that maybe are more in the anti-vax camp, I think already maybe started from a place of a innate mistrust of the medical field. And I think maybe for some people it may just tend to snowball. Maybe it has a snowball effect, and vaccines are, kind of low hanging fruit that are kind of easily attacked because because everybody gets them, and or most people get the and so I do think that you're spot on. I mean, I have a lot of discussions with very intelligent people, and it's just like you said, who are you trusting, and having that maybe this just gets back to the fact that patients and doctors, and I think today's pediatricians and family doctors that are administering vaccines, the younger generation, are do make more of an effort to engage the parents, questions and trust. And I think back in the day, when you hear these online horror stories of the doctor just yelling at the parent or speaking down to them, I would at least hope that maybe that was a doctor of kind of maybe more of the old guard type of person. So I think that's never a constructive conversation.
No.
Um, so I feel like it's we need to do better in that in communicating with our parents, and kind of rebuilding that trust. I think it's going in that direction because you do see vaccination rates in most parts of the countries are on the rise, but in other part their refusals are also up. So I think we are making progress.
Yeah, I think we are too. And if you approach people who have skepticism about vaccines with empathy and respect, then you're going to get a lot further than treating them like they're not a person with realistic thoughts and concerns. Is going to push them
Absolutely.
even more into their personal views. So, Christina, what have you experienced with this? How did your trust shift as you started to learn more information about vaccines in general? Did you was that part of the whole vaccine talk experience? Did you have this skepticism against the medical industry as well first starting out?
Um, I couldn't really give you a pinpoint of when stopped. Not really stopped. I didn't ever like just blatantly not trust the um, medical community. I'm kind of a hybrid in the sense of you know, uh, I live in the middle of nowhere. Like we joke in my family that we live 20 minutes outside of the middle of nowhere because I literally like we're 20 miles outside of a town of 60 people, and then from there it's another hour to the nearest Walmart.
Oh gosh.
So we when I got together with my husband, I had always known that he wanted to move back here, and being so far away from any medical establishments, I wanted to start learning how to handle things at home because I've never been that parent that wants to run their child to the doctor for every sneeze or every sniffle, um, and I wanted to start learning before I ever had kids ways to handle things at home. And I'm not sure what it is exactly um, about being holistic like that. about trying to avoid the medications and prescriptions. But it seems like a lot of those communities are more prone to believing in the anti-vax rhetoric. And I think after seeing, these same statements by so many different people over and over again, you're in these groups, and a lot of times they have thousands of people in them. So you see these same comments from, not necessarily from thousands of different people, but from a group that has thousands of people in it who are at different levels of participation. It's easy to start, questioning your own, your own mindset and your own thoughts and perspectives that you were exposed to previously. And I guess at a certain point, I think we're really bad about really informing people in general about some of the, even if they are small risks, the risks associated with a lot of medications and a lot of procedures. And realizing, when I came to start realizing that a lot of times, it's a blip in a conversation, these risks, it made me start, it really, almost launched me into the rabbit hole of anti-vax information, because, it's all about, informed consent. And, but the thing is, with informed consent, it's only informed consent if you're actually getting legitimate information on both sides of the spectrum, and enough to make that truly informed decision. And are there risks? We've already concluded that there are. However, there's not enough conversation on why the benefits outweigh the risks in these situations. I think I answered your question, but I may have gotten off a little bit there.
No, that was good. That was good. I think that's true, actually. The risk versus benefits is unbalanced, and I'm hoping to balance that out with this show. And I think that's what we're doing now. So that's fun. So, okay, in terms of biases and heuristics, right? If we're trying to understand how we perceive the world, and within that framework, what's true, we need to understand our lens on our perception, because that's how we interpret information. So I think one thing that could help is bias saliency, showing people their bias, because it can help you hold more objective and nuanced positions when it comes to emotionally charged topics like vaccines. So that's kind of where the empathy and stuff comes into play, but also recognizing how you view things. Have you experienced this at all, Dr. Sears, with showing people, if they're kind of hesitant with vaccines, that they've got a certain lens that they interpret the world through that they might be able to notice?
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. I think, one of the hardest things to overcome in, whether you're talking about what you think about a certain topic, or if you're talking about looking at a medical study, is where's the bias in this study? I mean, then there is a whole laundry list of different types of biases, and we encounter it every day. And I think it's really, in many cases, you could argue it's a certain amount of bias is really inescapable. I think.
I
You
would
can't.
agree with that.
And so, when you have issues, but what sometimes I think what happens with some folks who maybe are more on the other side of, maybe on the fence about vaccines, or very much anti-vax, they are a victim of what we refer to as confirmation bias, where they just
Right.
automatically go looking for data or evidence that supports their preconceived ideas, or what they believe them to be. And so I think that's a good stepping off point for a discussion, though. I think, where, say, well, if you're spending all your time on a few Facebook sites and looking at studies from that, that's kind of a narrow view. And, I do my best to review as much as I can in the medical literature, and also what's around in the popular, literature of this, and so I think, that's a good point, that I think that a lot of people just, and I think maybe this is human nature, if they have a certain preconceived idea of something, they're more likely to find more evidence to just reinforce that
Right.
that
You could
belief.
probably tell it by simple Google terms, by
Well,
Do vaccines kill or do vaccines save lives? I mean, those two Google searches themselves are going to affect the information that you find. So that's why it's
yeah.
good to try to disprove yourself instead of prove yourself. So
And see, I made that choice a long time ago, Isaac. I said, I'm going to approach this from the standpoint that vaccines may be harmful, and I want to come at it from that standpoint. Put myself in the other person's shoes. I think if we do that in many areas of life, I think we can learn a lot. So
I agree.
but I also think that that's also then gets back to the empathy you were talking about, how then maybe somebody who's more skeptical and not quite sure about this doctor that wants to inject my kids, but if you engage it in that way, I think you can really build a lot more trust that.
I agree with that, and I've seen that for myself with dialogue with my own mom. We get to talk because I listen, and that's the first step to a real conversation. So I think that's enough about perceptual aspects of this discussion. Let's get more into the more objective information. So vaccine court, I think that's a good place to step off of that from. So interestingly enough, vaccine court was actually requested by anti-vaccine activists in 1980s, the dissatisfied parents union, and they have a lower burden of proof. They pay your lawyer fees, so there are a lot of benefits to vaccine court the anti-vaxxers actually asked for, and now it's evidence that big pharma is poisoning your kids, which is ironic, but you also can sue the manufacturer, but you have to go through vaccine court first. So I'll show you guys both some evidence about this. Okay, here we go. So this is information about the vaccine court. Okay, all of the links will be in the comments later, but
Yeah, it's
you'll
an
look at
interesting
this.
program.
Yeah, so this is the Dissatisfied Parents Union. They drafted the Vaccine Act, and this is where it says that you can still sue the manufacturers after, and few people choose to because their awards are so good in vaccine court. And they wanted it because it generously compensates victims of vaccine injury and improves vaccine safety. But now it's evidence that against vaccines, even though it was requested initially. So I thought that was
And
particularly interesting.
it's an interesting. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can't see you. Go ahead
Yeah.
and try to rejoin real quick if you can. Just exit real quick and then hop back in. But I'll talk to Kristina about this real quick. So Kristina, what have you heard about vaccine court?
Well, it's quite a common claim. Well, not it's truth, but it's only partial truth in regards to the fact that there's been. This was back in January, I think, when I last looked. So I'm sure it's quite a bit more than this now. Sorry, my husband had to bring my son in
You're good.
into the room I'm in. So, and it set the cat off. So I apologize for the background.
That's fine.
But there's quite a common, mention of the fact that there's been like well over $4 billion in awards regarding perceived vaccine injury, and there's not a lot really talked about in regards one way or the other to give information about the burden of proof, and not a lot of it is easy to believe.
Scary.
And what was that?
It's like a scary figure, like $4 billion, but then no information. Have you experienced that a lot, Dr. Sears, with don't you know about $4 billion and then no information about how many claims?
Common like talking points, on the over, $4 billion order. And it sounds like and it is a big number. That's a big number, but you have to understand this was established in 1986. It's been around almost 35 years.
Right.
So when you look at it, when you really look at it from that perspective, I mean, there's other, when you talk about spreading $4 billion out over a 35-year period, it loses a little bit of its punch in terms of the amounts. It's still a large amount, don't get me wrong, but but over that 35 years, it's about, I think, around 6,000 cases awarded. So, and I think if you break that down,
high sums too.
That's right, and that's a large amount per. But if during that time, it's an interesting little numbers game that I worked out, that I worked back and said during that time there's been approximately 6 billion vaccines given in this country, 6 billion over that time, and you've had 6,000 cases awarded in the VICP program, vaccine course. So when you look at it, what does that number work out to? That's 1 in a million.
Oh, that's what's on the CDC website, actually.
Oh, wow. Well, what do you know? So, I mean, if you take the 6 billion shots that are given during this time and the 6,000 awarded cases for these severe events that may have been related to the vaccines, that literally works out to 1 in a million. One adverse event possibly related to vaccines for every million dose given.
Right.
And there is research to suggest that a majority of them, as much as 70%, they really could never prove that it was the vaccine at all that really actually caused the adverse event.
Yes, and so that's actually what I wanted to bring up next, because if you talk about the numbers of the vaccine court, people will bring up VAERS. And in terms of VAERS cases, there's only a 3% association with VAERS reports and actual vaccine injury. There's gunshot wounds in there. Drowning is in the insert. There's one person put a VAERS report that a vaccine turned him into the Incredible Hulk. So I got to show you guys this because it sounds so made up, but it's not. So, okay, first off, casualty with vaccine reactions. This is the paper. 3% of reports are definitely causally related to the vaccine. Over 50%, there's like no way. And here's information about overreporting. So minor reports are underreported because why would you report a rash? But overreporting, like death, is definitely a problem. Then you have things like this where this guy reported that he turned into the Hulk, and they accepted and entered it into the database. So, that's something to think about. So,
yeah, VAERS is not a good game. VAERS is not useful at all in assessing vaccine safety in any way. It's an independent reporting system, but it's useful because the CDC can use it to track trends. If they start seeing more reports put in VAERS of a certain, that allows them to say, well, maybe we need to look into that. Right,
but it's definitely not something that you can just look. I mean, if it is, then maybe vaccines do turn you into the Hulk, and I'm fine with experimenting that thesis because I'm not the strongest, but yeah, it's not something that seems so reliable. So, Kristina, how often did you see the VAERS cases that just look in VAERS and you see all these potential vaccine injuries, even though there's so many reports of it? Does that get brought up a lot?
Definitely. That's another thing that really kind of kept me, on that anti-vaccine end of the spectrum for so long. You hear about VAERS all the time. Like that's all you hear about. You don't ever hear about, these anti-vaccine, predominantly anti-vaccine groups, the fact that there is other reporting systems. I had no idea until I think like 2 or 3 months into being in vaccine talk that they actually do have a reporting system that automatically watches people's medical records to pull out basically potential reactions or serious events that happen.
I didn't know that. That's very interesting.
I'm wanting to say it's the Vaccine Safety Data Link.
Safety
or
Link
that
Data
is that
Project, I think.
Yeah, okay. It looks like Dr. Sears is affirming that. So that really, you have all these reports that are in VAERS, and it looks scary when there's so many different reports, some of them very serious. And so that really helped. That's another thing that really kind of helped. Like I said, you've mentioned, I'm still not totally pro-vax, but I'm definitely, like, I'm not, I'm almost entirely on the opposite end of the spectrum, and that fact alone really, brought some peace of mind. The fact that there is a system that keeps an eye on serious events to check for any casualties or any casual relationships between these events and vaccines, because it's got an algorithm that works to to put those correlations together to so that doctors and scientists and researchers know that this needs to be looked at.
Right. So in terms of actual vaccine reactions, that not in the VAERS, but actual reported reactions, so these are adverse reactions, they seem to happen, but they are rare. And so the benefits of vaccines are hard to recognize because if a vaccine works, nothing happens. That's the point. So you don't see anything. It's hard to realize, oh, that worked. So it's kind of hidden in plain sight. Have you experienced any of those claims in your practice, Dr. Sears?
Well, yeah, I mean, like you said, it's like basically vaccines are a victim of their own success. I mean, we don't see these VFDs. The vast majority of kids that get them, they don't have any terrible adverse outcomes, and so they're kind of, like you said, hiding in plain sight. Um, you know, a lot of my issues is kind of working through people who maybe felt there's maybe some potential vaccine injury that really can't be proven or anything. But as far as that, as far as well, I mean, I did touch on the adverse events or adverse reactions that I've experienced in the beginning.
Right.
But again, that's why these reporting systems are important. I mean, because it's important to have the data and have these public reporting systems available. They just have to be taken with a grain, with a grain of salt.
Yeah. And the data is there for the real adverse reaction. So we can actually find that. This is linked as well, but it's about 1 in a million. But you mentioned the febrile seizures, which are probably the most common, but still very few in every 10,000. And everything else is between 1 in 20,000 or 100,000 doses. So yes, adverse events happen, and that's worth saying so that people realize you're being intellectually honest, but you've got to emphasize that they're so rare.
Well, and probably the scariest, the scariest and most frequent of the really rare are the febrile seizures that has been shown in the MMR it's in one in every 2,500 cases, which is still extremely rare, but it's unsettling, absolutely. But and they're benign, so it's but
Yeah, and you already mentioned the paradox of success. Vaccines work so well, we don't see the diseases that we're vaccinating against. So how often do you hear, oh, well, measles isn't a problem anymore? No one has died from the measles in 30 years. So why do I need the vaccine?
talk to some parents in Samoa about that.
Well, that's actually fitting because that gets into the sanitation and hygiene argument. So most people will say, oh, Samoa, they don't have good sanitation and hygiene, right? So this is an interesting point. And then I'll ask you both what you think about this once it's made. So sanitation and hygiene is something I hear all the time when it comes to vaccines. But the problem with that is the correct measure is disease incidence, not deaths, because all deaths did decrease from vaccines. If you can see here, this is measles. all deaths decrease at the same rate because of sanitation and hygiene, right, from deaths. But and it looks like the vaccine wasn't even necessary. But if you look at disease incidence, right, this is graphed over, the cases of the disease don't drop until the individual vaccine. And on this website, Graphical Proof Vaccines Work with Sources, you can actually see the cases all only drop after the introduction of each individual vaccine. You can see in polio, the year is different. And even in different countries, diphtheria, the year is way different. But all the deaths decrease around the same time. So that's why you need to be making sure people are including the metric of disease incidence. So you hear all the time sanitation and hygiene, but you're not getting the full story. So, Kristina, have you experienced that argument a lot? Like it was sanitation and hygiene that solved all the problems. Vaccines were completely ineffective.
All the time. And well, frankly, I know this is a little controversial here, but I think we're really seeing, with this whole coronavirus thing going on, if that were the case, then, regardless of whether or not the, death rate is being manipulated to look one way versus another, the virus is still spreading. And if it were just about sanitation and hygiene, well, frankly, we wouldn't have the rates that we do, regardless of how it's turning out. It wouldn't be spreading the way it is if that's all there was to it. And I don't think a lot of people are taking into consideration the different forms of transmission of illness and disease.
Right. And it's just interesting to see whenever you talk about the third countries, sanitation and hygiene is always brought up. But you could even see data that the diseases are still only dropping with the vaccination introduction. So, Dr. Sears, how often do you hear this argument about sanitation and hygiene and mortality rates?
It's a very common one. I would argue, though, that you could look at some more recent vaccinations. We kind of have this idea that a lot of the vaccines that are on the regular schedule have been around since forever and this and that. But a great example to start with is the Haemophilus influenza B vaccine, the HIB is what it's known as. And that's only been around since 85. And then they revised it and made it better in 87. So we're talking about a vaccine that's only been around about 30 years. Prior to the vaccine, Hib meningitis was far and away the most common bacterial meningitis in the pediatric population, and it caused over 10,000 hospitalizations a year and usually about 1,000 deaths a year from meningitis. And we're talking about in the 70s and 80s. We're not talking about a time when sanitation, we're not talking about a time before running water or plumbing or this and that.
Right.
And I have a good little story. My dad, William Sears, he was when he was in working in hospitals as a pediatric resident in the mid to late 60s before there was a Hib vaccine. They had a Hib meningitis vaccine ward in the children's hospital. They had an entire wing, hospital dedicated to children with Hib meningitis, and the devastating disease. 2 to 3% mortality rate, 10 to 30% of kids who got Hib meningitis would have long-term complications. A devastating illness that we just got under control in the mid to late 80s. So let's not kid ourselves here about this whole hygiene argument that that's all we need and we don't need vaccines to keep kids healthy. Another one is the rotavirus vaccine. The one we're using now has only been around since 2006. And prior to that, you had in the U.S. in a more sanitized, hygienic environment, every year before that vaccine was introduced, you had 55,000 to 70,000 admissions, hospital admissions of kids with rotavirus. And now there weren't that many deaths. There's only between 20 and 60 deaths a year. But we're not just concerned about deaths. We're concerned about kids being in the hospital, especially in this day and age with coronavirus, and we're trying to reduce hospitalizations and keep hospital beds open. So, and this is a vaccine that's been around for not even 15 years yet. And if you want to make the hygiene argument, rotavirus is definitely spread by poor hygiene. And we're still seeing that in this state. But if you see cases of rotavirus now of hospitalizations, I'd have to get up the numbers. But I mean, it's drastically reduced. I mean, between the 55,000 to 70,000 kids a year prior to the vaccine, that's only been around for not too long. So the sanitation and hygiene argument it just doesn't really do much for me. I don't think there's really any good data to show that. Look at the measles outbreaks in last year in America in the undervaccinated areas. This is in a first world country.
Right. It's the problem that it's reducing mortality overall. And so everyone's just saying that's all we need. And like you brought up perfectly, it's not quite enough. So
we
okay.
care more about a lot more of complications than just death.
Right. There are still serious long-term effects, permanent lung damage, not something we want for everyone. So I do want to talk about coronavirus and the vaccine for it briefly. I know none of us are experts on that, but there are some things that should be said. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of vaccine safety is ingredients. So a lot of people are afraid about toxic ingredients like formaldehyde and different ingredients in vaccines that can look scary and can appear like, oh, why would that ever be in a vaccine unless they're trying to poison us, that kind of thing. But if you actually look at some of the research on some of these ingredients, adjuvants, antigens, all of that, we'll stick with formaldehyde for now. You can actually see a baby has 12 to 240 times more formaldehyde in her blood than in any given vaccine shot. And so even if you say injection is different than ingestion, that argument doesn't hold because this is already in their bloodstream. And the reason is because formaldehyde is important for DNA synthesis, and the dose makes the poison, as simply as that. And so it's hard because these ingredients look frightening, but when you have all of the information, you see that there's really nothing to worry about when it comes to this kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, formaldehyde is a very simple molecule. It's carbon, hydrogen, a couple of hydrogens, and oxygen. Dose makes the poison. It's very simple, like you said. It's not about the name. It's about how much we're dealing with, and we're dealing with trace amounts, 40 or 50 times more higher in an infant at any one time than it's any shot. Similar arguments for the aluminum salts and adjuvants, but Google the ingredients of an apple, and they'll have a bunch of scary words on them.
Yeah. I just saw I saw a post about the ingredients of a banana, and someone just had the ingredients and said, "Would you put this in your body?" And someone said, "No way! I would never put that in my body. It's an apple." But you just don't know because it looks frightening. So you can give that tone to just about anything. How about you, Kristina? How have you seen the scare tactics kind of in the memes that say, "Oh, look, would you inject this?"
Yeah, definitely. And I think it was Dr. Sears that said this. I heard it, didn't quite process who was talking. I apologize. But like one of you two said, a lot of these ingredients are already in your body, and I think maybe both of you mentioned it. And it's already in your body. It's already in the foods we eat, our environment, and learning more about the way that the body processes these ingredients that are in vaccines helped a lot as well. Such as like even if aluminum salts were dangerous in large amounts, I'm pretty sure that's the one anyways, one of the things I had looked at is, even if it's dangerous in large amounts, the way that the body processes it with the vaccine is there's such a minuscule amount that processes in any given time frame that it's virtually the same as if you were getting it via other environmental factors, such as eating or breathing the air in the city at least.
highest contributor to the body burden of aluminum is breathing. So if you really want to avoid it, just hold your breath. Works. So
Forever.
okay,
It
yeah,
works.
yeah, it'll work for a short amount of time. So I think that's a good entry point into COVID-19. So coronavirus is scaring a lot of people, and that is the vaccine for it is no exception. So in terms of COVID-19 and the vaccine, um, Dr. Sears, this is kind of going to be rapid fire at you. Let's see. So, do you think there will even ever be a coronavirus vaccine? Because they've tried to make one before and they haven't successfully made one before. What do you think on that?
Well, as you may have seen it, the one a lot of people are talking about from Moderna is now just entering phase 3 trials. They just announced that they were going to start phase 3 trials hopefully shortly, which is really the final stage. And they're looking to, they had a smaller group in the phase 2. It looked promising. So now they're looking to recruit about 30,000 people. About 30,000 people for the phase 3 trials. And then that's, you're still looking at probably about a 6-8 month, maybe less process for that, where they'll divide them into placebo group and ones that will receive the shot. And there's over 100 that are in the works. So I'm actually hopeful. I mean, I think if you talk to most experts, they are hopeful with the way the vaccine, the structure of it, and there's a lot of optimism about it, about whether or not now how effective will it be, how long term, how long term are we talking about? That's nobody has the answer to that.
Right, still kind of up in the air. So, what do you think about the microchip? Do you think it will have a microchip? I think personally that if it has a microchip, it will freak people out and reduce the confidence people have in the vaccine. And I think because of that, people are aware of that. I don't think we'll have a microchip. But any thoughts?
Well, I don't think there's going to be one in the vaccine. I think they've talked about
So, yeah.
tracking people who have received it or not, but I really, I don't really look at that too much. I mean, I think that's always something we want to be aware of, with surveillance and all that is certainly a concern. But I see a lot of conspiracy theories going on about the chip and Bill Gates and all that. And
Yeah, I'm hoping it's not in the vaccine. I don't think that's even possible,
I
and I
don't
don't
think
think they would
the
even do it.
technology is not. I don't think the technology is there to do it.
Yeah, right. So,
We
so
have
that
bigger
can,
fish.
we can not worry about that, unless it turns out being a thing. But for now, no evidence. This is a good question, and Christina, you have an interesting thought process on this because you're against mandates. So, oh, you're good. I'll ask Peter first. So, most
Yeah.
vaccines are only mandated for public education and workforces such as medicine or military. So, do you think that there's any reason that this vaccine would have the mandate expanded onto additional sectors of public life, such as workforce and travel? Because it seems like if that happens, it might generate some reactance to the vaccine.
Right, and and that's a difficult. You're referring to just the COVID vaccine right now,
Just the
right?
COVID vaccine, right? The
So
mandatory nature.
yeah, yeah, so there are a couple different interesting things you'll see if you look at polls about from Americans about who if they've been asked, would you receive the COVID vaccine, and the rates are as low as 50%, as high as 70% would say they would get it. So on the high end, that's pretty good. The low end, I don't know, but so a lot of people are thinking they want to try to set a goal of about if we can vaccinate 70% of the population, I think that's a good thing. But there's a whole lot of factors, who already has antibodies and who do you go for first. And I don't feel that there will be I don't think it'll be mandated for everyday life. I really don't think it will. I as a healthcare provider, I will receive it. And I know that certainly hospitals will probably require, people to receive it if they're going to be around high risk individuals. But I don't think, I don't think you'll see a mandate for the general population. But schools could be that's an interesting conundrum when it comes to school mandates and whether or not where COVID may play into that, the COVID vaccine.
Right, but vaccines for school and work have been a thing forever, and vaccines for any other areas which they are concerned about is a little bit of a different story. So me and Christina personally, not as on board when it comes to mandates, especially if it was to travel, like to drive, you need a COVID vaccine. You know, that's just too far. And we both believe in voluntary vaccination, and I think fingers crossed, voluntary vaccination rates should be enough to prevent mandate pressure. I don't think there will be enough pressure from the public to mandate the vaccine because I think the compliance levels will be high because everybody is concerned about coronavirus. Do you have any thoughts on that, Christina?
Um, no, just like you said, I think there's enough, speculation on the seriousness that I think we've seen that even though there is a fairly low death rate. Like if you're looking at percentages, I think we've seen how easily it can transmit. And as a common talking point in vaccine talk is you'll have the highest percentage of people is going to be pro-vaccine, and then you have the next tier down of they're on the fence whether they may question, but they'll still get it, and then next, you'll have those that question it just enough to, their hesitance is just enough to prevent them from getting it. And then you have those that will never get a vaccine for anything, no reason. You could kill them before they would allow you near them with a needle. And, but I think, especially if we, as a whole, can get people to better understand what fast tracking is. I don't remember enough about the process to explain it myself. But if we could get, more people to understand that fast tracking doesn't mean that it's not being tested, there would be a higher level of willingness to get that vaccine.
That makes sense, actually.
And, I think there's still going to be that hesitancy in general, just because it is such a new vaccine. Any new vaccine comes out, you're going to have even a certain percentage of highly, pro-vax parents and, adults, they would consider it, but they want that time to kind of gauge what happens. But it's, so it's going to be like any other vaccine in that regard. Gardasil is a good example. I mean, we're still, I have my own thoughts on that, but that's irrelevant in this particular discussion. Where we've had it for, regular use for like coming up on, 15 years at least. I think it had just started, really heavily being used when I was going into middle school. And, it had only started really being pushed in my like sixth or seventh grade year. And we still have people that are kind of hesitant, but it seems like the levels have been steadily increasing. So I think the coronavirus vaccine is going to have kind of a similar rate where as people have the chance to see what what reactions do or don't happen, and how it, we're living in this particular example, we're going to see live results of what the vaccine does or doesn't do, and which will directly, for our generations, will directly affect the trust or distrust of it.
Yeah, that's true. What do you think about that, Dr. Sears? Because I think Christina made an interesting point. Do you think that it's true that if you show people fast tracking is still a process of safety data and investigation into efficacy, and it's not just whipping up a vaccine in your kitchen and giving it to everyone? Do you think that would probably make it to where more people voluntarily vaccinate, so mandates aren't even on the table? Because personally, I would like it where everyone voluntarily vaccinates. I like the idea of voluntary interactions. So if we could get everyone to do it on their own, no exemptions, that's perfect in my mind.
Right, and I think hey, I agree with it, and like I mentioned earlier, with the Moderna vaccine, I mean, they're going to recruit 30,000 individuals to do the phase 3 trial, and I think you'll see people that wouldn't otherwise be riveted at their computer screens trying to follow the rotavirus vaccine trials or the the other one, people will be actively invested and observing these in real time as it unfolds, and almost in some way just allowing themselves to almost be participants in a strange way, because then they will be considering receiving this product. So, I mean, I think that since it's so in the media and these studies are being followed and be easily followed by any layman out there, I think that there will be, hopefully, as you said, Kristina, hopefully there will be maybe some increased trust. Right now, the polls I'm seeing, I'm not sure if y'all are seeing different polls. I mean, anywhere from being 50 and 70% of Americans are saying they'll get the shot, or they get the COVID vaccine. But hopefully, we'll see those numbers closer to that higher end, assuming it's deemed safe and effective. I mean, we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves there, anyways. But yeah.
Right. Well, I think that's an optimistic note to end the discussion on. Do either of you have anything to add? You want to throw in on the top, maybe a cherry to put on the sundae?
If you're indoors in public, please just wear a mask. we're finding more and more about that the data is showing. Look, if you're indoors, especially if you can't social distance, it's working, and obviously the other things are important too. Washing your hands and keeping the social distances. Don't go out if you don't, if it's not necessary, but and stay safe. So hopefully,
doctor. Thank you. And Kristina, do you have anything else you want to add before we talk about where we're going to continue the discussion after?
Just the fact that we really need to collectively get better at washing our hands. It's kind of disgusting how many people don't. What was that?
For 20 seconds, there's this trick. Wash your hands like you just marinated jalapenos and you're about to itch your eyes.
Oh, I know it.
Great strategy. Actually, you could do a trial where you actually do marinate a jalapeno and see how long you do wash your hands. But yeah, I would agree with that as well. So I want to thank both of you for coming on. Go ahead.
So one more thing, I think a great topic, because I see the comments, and I think this would be a great topic for another discussion, is the issue of mandates, and this has come up, but I think that's a whole episode in of itself. So I'd love to be able to do that in the future with regards to school and whatnot.
The first episode of my other vaccine show, Bridging the Gap, Paul Offit discussed mandates with my friend Lynette Marie Barron, and she leans more hesitant against vaccines, and they're both friends, so it was a real great discussion, but it's something that should be explored further. So this was a great talk, and I want to continue it. So this conversation is going to continue in Vaccine Talk. So Vaccine Talk is the group Kristina was talking about earlier that she went into and found information about vaccines. You can be anti-vaccine, pro-vaccine, it doesn't matter. Search the hashtag straight to the point. So real quick, I'll show you guys the group so you can see it. Man, I love that effect. So just go type in vaccinetalk.org, enter, and then you'll be in the group. And so here you are. You can search straight to the point, and you'll find the discussion for this episode. And hopefully we see both of you guys in there, Peter and Kristina. Are you guys both in the group?
I'm on. Yeah, I'm in Vaccines Talks. I won't be able to right now. I might get on later on this evening. I got to run a little bit now and do some other stuff, but I'll be there.
Great, cool. So that's where we will continue the discussion. And this is a podcast now, straight to the point. So it's under The Lucid Truth. So if you want to follow it, it's on thelucidtruth.com, the Lucid Truth YouTube channel. And if you just have a podcatcher like Spotify or iTunes, you can just search straight to the point. But I recommend the YouTube channel, because if you listen to it on a podcatcher, you can't get the visuals and can't see our faces and you can't see the data, but at least you get the audio still. So thank you guys both for coming on again. I hope we can have some future discussions, and I will see everyone in Vaccine Talk. So see you there. Thanks, everyone. You can find and support the podcast at our website, straighttothepointshow.com. And the podcast is also available on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, and other podcatchers. So, thank you for listening, and I hope to see you for the next episode of Straight to the Point.